In this video, we're going to look at sections 8.4 and 8.5. Section 8.4 is about creating a survey. And when we're creating a survey, some things that we want to think about are what we want to know, who are the right respondents, what are the right questions, and what will be done with the results. So you want to make sure when you're writing a survey that you're not asking unnecessary questions. The quality of the survey instrument, which is usually a questionnaire, can be a source of error. So you want to ask good questions and you want to make sure that your questions are actually getting at what it is that you want to know. You also want to use the right sampling frame. You want to make sure your sampling frame accurately represents the population that you're interested in. You want to ask specific questions and you want to watch for biases. So we talked about how bias can come from how you select your sample. If your individuals who don't respond have common characteristics, your sample will suffer from non-response bias. So for example, if you're doing a survey where people are asked to respond online, or you're doing an email survey, then people who don't have access to the internet or don't have email addresses will not be counted. And those people have different characteristics than the population as a whole. Another type of bias comes from voluntary response bias. So if your survey is structured in such a way that people have to call in or write in or visit a website in order to respond, then people with strongest feelings are more likely to respond, and people who have less strong feelings or don't necessarily care one way or another are not going to be motivated to call in or write in or go to your website. And that's called voluntary response bias. You want to be careful with question phrasing. You want to make sure that your questions are asking what you intend for them to ask, and you want to be careful with your answer phrasing. You want to make sure that all possible answers are taken into account. If they're not, this gives you what's called a measurement error. Note that measurement error is not the same thing as sampling error. Measurement error means that people go to answer a question and they say, well, the answer that I would pick is not an option. So then I have to pick something else, and that's going to mess up your results. The best way to prevent errors in your survey is what's called a pilot test. Pilot test is basically a practice survey. So and especially if you're doing a large or really expensive survey, you're going to want to do a pilot test first to make sure that you're not wasting all your money on doing a survey that's not written very well. So pilot test is when you basically do a small practice group and you see how it goes, and then if you need to make any changes, you can make them before you do the actual survey. So here's some examples. The following question appears on a sample survey. Is the question biased? If so, suggest changes. So the first question is, given the importance of high-speed internet to your child's education, would you subscribe to such a service if it were offered? So in this question, this first part here, given the importance of high-speed internet to your child's education. The problem with that part is that it makes people feel that if they say no, they're not going to subscribe, it makes them feel like they're bad parents or that they don't care about their child's education. So this is biased because it makes people feel bad if they answer no. So you want to avoid things like this in questions where it kind of has like an emotional component, where it's making people feel a certain way about answering one way or the other. And really, you could just take that whole part out and ask, would you subscribe to high-speed internet if it were offered? And now, with the question worded this way, I don't feel, I could say yes, I would, or I could say no, I wouldn't, but I don't feel any emotional pull to answer one way or the other. Looking at question 2, should concerned dog owners vaccinate their pets? And so the key word here, I think, is concerned. Because using that word makes it seem like if you don't vaccinate your pets, then that means that you're not concerned about them. So people aren't going to say, no, they shouldn't vaccinate their pets, because then that would make them seem like bad pet owners. And people don't want to, seem bad when they're answering a survey. So this question is also biased for the same reason as the first one. It makes people feel bad to say no. And really, we could just take that word concerned out and say, should pets be vaccinated, or should dog owners vaccinate their pets? There's no reason for that word concern to be in there. Looking at the third example, do you think that price or quality is more important in selecting an internet service provider? So thinking about the way this question is worded, I could answer price is more important, or I could answer quality is more important, but there's nothing in the question that suggests that I should answer one way or the other. So this is a good question. It seems unbiased. There's nothing in the question that says, that makes me feel a way about any of the answers. So next we're going to look at section 8.5. This is about some different sampling methods that are not as good as doing a random sample. And the first method is called a voluntary response sample. Voluntary response samples are when people are invited to respond, and anyone who wants to respond can. So normally with the voluntary response sample, you have to call, or you have to go to a website, or write in, or something like that, where you're asking people to respond. And they're almost always biased, because people who choose to respond tend to have stronger feelings. And a really good example of this is like when you go to a restaurant and like Taco Bell, and they print a survey on the back of your receipt. Now, generally, people who have, an okay experience at the restaurant, or a fairly good experience at the restaurant, they're not going to be bothered to respond. But if somebody has a bad experience at the restaurant, the first thing they're going to do is call that number and voice their opinion. So for that type of survey, you're going to get a lot more negative feedback than if you just kind of look at how people actually feel about the restaurant. Because most people are going to have an okay experience, but if they have an okay experience, they're not going to be bothered to call and give their opinion. But the people who have a negative experience are going to be more likely to do that. And another example is here with this Ann Landers survey. People wrote in, 70% of people who wrote in said that having kids was not worth it, and they wouldn't do it over again if they had the choice. But a random sample showed that 91% of parents would have kids again. So the drastically different responses is due to the fact that people with strong negative opinions about having kids were more likely to write in. And this often happens in situations where the opinion is maybe a little bit controversial, or something like this. You could say, well, I have a strong opinion that having kids is not worth it. Kind of the more mainstream opinion is that, I love my kids and I would have them again if I had the choice. So people with the more mainstream opinions are less likely to share them, while people with kind of the more fringe or controversial opinions are going to be more likely to want to share their opinions. So people with strong negative opinions were more likely to write in. So that's one type of sample that has some issues with it. Another type of sample that can cause problems is called convenience sampling, where we include the individuals who are convenient. And this makes the sampling a lot easier, but the problem is that it can introduce some bias. So for example, if you want to get local reaction to a controversial new film, and you wait outside the theater during the afternoon show and ask the first 20 people how much they liked the movie. This group may not be representative of the population. The problem is that you're not asking the people who didn't go to the movie what their opinion was. And presumably people who went to the movie went to it because they thought they would like it, and people who aren't going to the movie, maybe there's people who have strong opinions that feel like they wouldn't like the movie, and that's why they're not going to see it. This picture here kind of shows it pretty well. You can see in our population we have a lot of yellow and orange people, but by just taking these bottom two rows, we don't have any yellow or orange people in our sample, and so that can cause a problem if the opinions of the yellow and orange people are a lot different from the opinions of the other colors. This is a problem in the business world because often what's easiest for a company is to get information from your customers. But the problem is that when you do that, you're not learning about people who aren't buying your products or aren't using your service. And so you're missing out on that valuable information that could turn non-customers into customers. So it's called undercoverage when some portion of the population is not sampled at all or is underrepresented in the sample. And so it's a good idea to have a smaller randomized survey for which you have the resources to ensure a high response rate, better than sending out a large number of surveys and risking what happening is that only a certain subset of the population is responding. So, looking at these two examples, a theater board member proposes that an employee stand at the door and ask theater goers their opinions. What might be a problem with the sampling method? The problem is that you aren't getting the opinions of people who are not going to the theater, which could be some valuable information. Why aren't they going to the theater? Maybe it's the price, maybe it's the show times. So you could get some information and then, make changes to your business to try to get more customers. Question 2, another board member suggests posting a questionnaire on the theater website and inviting responses there. The problem with this method is that only people with internet access are able to respond. So generally, if you have something that requires the internet to respond to it, you probably are not getting an accurate representation of the entire population. Older people are less likely to have internet access, and so they're going to be less likely to respond to your survey. Another problem with this is that it's voluntary response. So people are more likely to respond if they have strong opinions.